The story begins at a mysterious hospital nestled near the ocean, where a young girl named Maddie stares into the camera with eyes full of dread. She is about to undergo a dangerous and life-altering operation. As the camera slowly pulls back, something deeply unsettling is revealed. Attached to her back is a strange and terrifying childlike entity, separate from her, yet unmistakably a part of her. Its mind was extraordinarily developed, capable of controlling the objects around it without any physical contact, and in a state of rage, it could become lethal to anyone nearby. For this reason, the doctors restrained Maddie and surgically separated the entity from her body. But the two minds were deeply intertwined, making a complete separation impossible. Attempting it would have cost Maddie her life. So instead, the doctors surgically embedded a portion of the entity's brain inside Maddie's own skull, and there it remained. The story then leaps 20 years into the future. That same girl has grown into a beautiful young woman, now heavily pregnant and on the verge of becoming a mother. But she has absolutely no idea that what is about to unfold will shake her to her very core. Arriving home one evening, Maddie finds her husband absorbed in a boxing match on television. Without a word, she picks up the remote and switches it off. Such a small, harmless act. Yet her husband erupts in a burst of blind rage, springs to his feet, and slams her head violently against the wall. He has no way of knowing that this single act of cruelty will ultimately cost him his life. Maddie suddenly becomes aware of a deep and serious wound at the back of her head. Overwhelmed with panic, she pushes past the pain and retreats into the bedroom, locking herself inside. When she reaches up and feels the wound, blood is already streaming down the back of her skull, and her condition is rapidly deteriorating. What she does not yet know is that her husband is about to pay a devastating price for what he has done. As night falls, her husband lies dozing on the sofa when a strange sound jolts him awake. He follows the noise to the kitchen, only to find the blender running on its own with no one in sight. Bewildered, he reaches out to switch it off, and at that very moment, the refrigerator door swings open by itself behind him. Completely rattled and unable to make sense of any of it, he begins to suspect that Maddie might be playing a trick on him to frighten him. Then, without warning, loud and frantic sounds erupt from the living room. He rushes in and stops dead. Seated on the sofa is a woman dressed entirely in black, methodically flipping through television channels. The moment he hits the light switch, she vanishes into thin air. He tries to convince himself that his eyes are deceiving him, until he notices the sofa cushion slowly rising back into place, as though someone had only just stood up from it. He is still standing there, frozen in thought, when the dark figure materializes directly behind him. Upstairs in the bedroom, Maddie is jolted awake by her husband's scream. Her eyes fall on the pillow beside her, soaked in blood. She reaches back and feels the wound, still weeping. Seized by panic, she races downstairs, and the sight that greets her stops her cold. Her husband is dead, his neck twisted at an impossible angle, his body lying in a grotesque and inexplicable stillness. And crouched nearby, with wild and disheveled hair, is the very same dark figure she had glimpsed before. Terror floods through her. She turns and bolts upstairs, desperate to get behind a locked door. But just as she reaches for it, the dark shadow lunges forward with enormous force, hurls her backwards, and she crashes to the floor, unconscious before she even lands. Shortly after, responding to calls from neighbors, the police arrive on the scene. The state of the body leaves them visibly shaken. What makes the case all the more baffling is that there is absolutely no sign of forced entry anywhere in the house. How the killer got inside is completely beyond explanation. The detective assigned to the case makes his way to the hospital to question Maddie. But having just lost her unborn child, she is shattered beyond words, far too broken to speak. Roughly 15 days later, Maddie is discharged and returns home. Almost immediately, something strange draws her attention. The streetlight outside begins flickering erratically on its own. Then she notices a figure in the distance, a man dressed entirely in black, walking steadily in her direction. Her fear comes crashing back like a wave. She sprints inside, sealing every door and window in the house. But the terror follows her. While sorting through laundry, she catches a glimpse of an unfamiliar woman's face reflected in the mirror. And before she can react, the dark figure surges forward, seizes the woman by the hair, and slams her savagely to the ground. In that same instant, the entire atmosphere of the room shifts in an inexplicable and deeply unsettling way. And without any warning, Maddie finds herself transported inside the woman's home. She has no idea how she got there or what is happening. Right before her eyes, the man in black snatches a trophy from a nearby shelf and falls upon the woman in a frenzy, striking her head again and again without stopping. Within seconds, Maddie is back inside her own home. Everything around her appears normal. For a brief moment she wonders if it was nothing more than a terrifying nightmare, but it was not. It was entirely real. The police soon arrive at the woman's home and quickly establish that her murder and the killing of Maddie's husband were carried out in an identical manner. It becomes immediately clear that the same person is responsible for both deaths. The murdered woman turns out to be a doctor named Glenn, the very doctor who had performed Maddie's operation 20 years earlier. Old patient files discovered at her home lead investigators to suspect that the killer may be connected to one of her former cases. The detective gathers every file and takes them back to the station, poring over each one with careful attention. That night, as Madhu climbs into bed, she is met with a sight that turns her blood cold. A large, heavy-set stranger is lying beside her in the dark. Her body goes completely rigid with fear. She cannot move, cannot make a sound. Then the dark shadow drifts out from behind her, slowly glides over the man, and drives a large knife into him, striking him over and over again in a relentless and savage assault. The moment the shadow vanishes, Maddie jolts upright, screaming. Shaken to her absolute limit, she rushes to the police station with her sister and tells the detective everything. But no one believes a word of it. The room fills with dismissive laughter, and she is treated as though she has lost her mind entirely. Her sister, furious at the response, challenges the detective openly. If nothing she has said turns out to be true, then lock us both away. That shuts the room down. The detective's expression shifts. Shortly after, Maddie tracks down the address of the heavy-set man online. He lives in the building directly across from hers. The detective and his partner accompany Maddie and her sister to investigate. And what they find inside silences everyone. The man is dead, exactly as Maddie had described. There is no longer any doubt in the detective's mind that she has witnessed the killer firsthand. A sketch is drawn up, based on Maddie's account. What emerges on the page is a haunting, ghoulish figure that looks barely human. The detective's partner once again begins to wonder whether Maddie is fabricating the entire thing. Maddie says nothing, and quietly walks away. Digging deeper into Dr. Glenn's files, the detective uncovers a deeply unusual case. The patient was a 7-year-old girl named Emily, who frequently reported seeing terrifying visions and demonic figures. 3 doctors had collaborated on a specialized treatment plan to help her. The detail that stops the detective cold is this. That same little girl had later changed her name. She had become Maddie. The detective looks up an old photograph of the 3 doctors. The moment he sees it, everything clicks into place. 2 of the 3 are already dead. The 3rd is still alive, but not for long. Meanwhile, Maddie is at home getting ready, when a sudden reflection in the mirror catches her eye. It is the 3rd doctor. The next moment, she is transported to the doctor's home. The detective arrives there not long after. When the door opens, he finds the doctor dead in the bathtub. Maddie is right there, desperately trying to get his attention, but he cannot see her, cannot hear her at all. Then, from above, the dark figure drops from the ceiling and hurls itself at the detective, throwing him to the ground before vanishing at speed. The detective gives chase and follows the creature deep into an abandoned building. Inside, it ambushes him from above, in a vicious and near-fatal attack. But the detective is highly trained and fights back hard, forcing the creature onto the defensive with his firearm. Sensing the tide turning against it, the figure abandons the fight, scales the wall with terrifying agility, and escapes. But the detective is now fully convinced the deaths of all 3 doctors are connected to Maddie. He goes directly to her home and presses her for the truth. Maddie, however, has no memory of anything before the age of 8. With no other option, the detective brings in a psychologist to attempt hypnosis, a way to draw Maddie's buried memories back to the surface. And as Maddie slips into the depths of her own past. Before the operation, the entity attached to the back of her skull was someone she had always called Gabriel. Gabriel had the ability to reach directly into her mind and force her to see terrifying things that had no existence in reality whatsoever. But when the doctors sealed a portion of his brain inside her skull after the surgery, that power was effectively cut off. Trapped and contained, Gabriel found another way. He began projecting himself into the bodies of other people and using them as vessels to hunt down and kill the very doctors who had imprisoned him. The detective listened to all of this with a growing sense of unease. Something about Maddie's account did not sit right with him. He felt she was holding something back. Before he could press her any further, a woman suddenly came crashing down from the ceiling and hit the floor directly in front of them. The room went completely silent. Everyone was horrified. Up until that moment, the general belief had been that Maddie was innocent, but now the picture began to shift in a deeply troubling direction. A woman had been held captive on the roof of Maddie's own home, and recovered alongside her were the killer's clothing and the murder weapon. Suspicion fell immediately and squarely on Maddie. The police wasted no time placing her under arrest. Maddie insisted over and over again that she had done nothing, that Gabriel was responsible for everything. Then, without warning, the detective's phone rang. An unknown caller. As the conversation unfolded, it became clear to him that the voice on the other end belonged to Gabriel, and that imprisoning the woman on the roof had been a deliberate move to frame Maddie. But even hearing that voice was not enough to convince the detective. He concluded that it was simply another layer of Maddie's deception, a calculated attempt to paint herself as the victim. Trusting his judgment, he had her formally arrested and locked away. Maddie's sister, however, refused to accept that Maddie was guilty. Determined to uncover the truth herself, she drove directly to the hospital where Maddie's original operation had taken place. When she arrived, she found the building completely abandoned, desolate and decayed, with no trace of anyone having been there in years. She went inside anyway, and after an exhaustive search, managed to locate Maddie's original operation file. She took it home immediately. When she played back the video recording inside, the full and devastating truth finally revealed itself. The entity attached to Maddie's skull from birth had been extraordinarily powerful, far more so than anyone had disclosed. Gabriel had not merely been showing Maddie frightening visions, he had been taking complete and total possession of her body, moving her limbs like a puppet, bending her entirely to his will, and he had never once hesitated to kill. It was precisely because of this that the doctors had sealed him permanently inside her skull. His control was all but eliminated. But on the night Maddie's husband slammed her head into the wall, the force of that impact had been enough to wake Gabriel from his long imprisonment. He broke free, and from that point on, he had been using Maddie's body to carry out every single one of the murders. The moment this truth became clear, Maddie's sister was overcome with terror. Inside the jail, a group of inmates had already identified Maddie as an easy target. They circled her, taunting and brutalizing her without mercy. She was alone, defenseless, and completely at their mercy. But the moment one of them reached out and yanked her by the hair, the cell block lights began to flicker violently. The atmosphere turned suffocating and wrong. In the very next instant, the inmate's hands were drenched in blood. Maddie's body began convulsing with tremendous force. And then, from somewhere deep inside her skull, a horrifying face began to push its way outward. And in the blink of an eye, Gabriel seized control of her entirely. The same men who had been brutalizing her just moments before were now in very serious danger. Gabriel moved through them one by one, with absolute brutality, dismantling each of them without hesitation or restraint. Within moments, every single inmate lay broken on the floor, and the cell block was soaked in blood. As he closed in on the last one, a guard burst through the door and opened fire. Gabriel grabbed the nearest inmate and used him as a human shield, then lunged forward and killed the guard without slowing down for even a second. In the meantime, Maddie's sister had reached the detective and laid out everything she had discovered about Gabriel. Then screams erupted from somewhere inside the police station. The detective rushed in, and what he found stripped the breath from his lungs. Every prisoner and several guards lay dead across the floor. Maddie was gone. What no one had anticipated was that Maddie had already broken through into the evidence room, retrieved her weapons, and was now tearing through the station with terrifying efficiency. Gabriel cut down officer after officer with horrifying speed and precision. He moved through Maddie's body in ways that defied comprehension, running in reverse, attacking without pause, fighting with a ferocity and skill that no officer in that building could match for more than a few seconds. The detective rushed in and called Maddie's name over and over, desperately trying to reach her. But the truth was that the real Maddie was still locked in her cell, completely unaware of everything Gabriel was doing in her name. When she finally caught sight of the detective standing there with his weapon drawn, she assumed he was the real killer. That fear destroyed any will she might have had to wrestle back control. Seizing the opening, Gabriel launched himself at the detective and sent his gun skidding across the floor. The detective's partner threw herself into the effort to restrain him, but could not hold on. Gabriel broke free and fled the station. The detective immediately understood what was coming next. The woman who had fallen from Maddie's ceiling was now the last loose end, and Gabriel was heading to the hospital to finish her off. Maddie's sister had already reached the hospital ahead of him, determined to move the woman somewhere safe. But the officers stationed outside had been given strict orders to allow no one through, and she was turned away at the door. Then the corridor lights began to flicker. The officer standing guard suddenly clutched his chest and buckled forward. Maddie's sister stepped toward him instinctively to help, and in the next instant, his chest erupted with a catastrophic impact, and he was dead before he hit the ground. She bolted for the room and threw herself against the door, trying desperately to seal it shut. But Gabriel was already there. A single savage kick reduced the door to splinters. The moment he stepped inside, every electronic device in the room shattered around him. His power was fully unleashed. He drew the knife and began moving toward her. Maddie was watching every moment of it from inside, screaming at him to stop, screaming with everything she had. But her body was not her own. Maddie's sister knew this. Despite the pain pressing down on her, she gathered what strength remained and made one final attempt to break through. She told Maddie that Gabriel had killed her children, that he was the reason she had suffered every miscarriage. Those words cut through everything. Something ignited deep inside Maddie, a rage so raw and absolute that it overwhelmed everything Gabriel had built around her. She threw every last shred of herself into reclaiming her own body, fighting him from the inside with everything she had. But before she could break through completely, Gabriel shot her sister. Then he turned to the woman lying in the hospital bed and ended her life too. And in that precise moment, a voice began to echo through Gabriel from within. The world around him shifted, the air changed, and he understood, with sudden and absolute certainty, that Maddie had woken up, that she had taken herself back. He came to his senses to find Maddie's sister still breathing on the floor. Gabriel stared. He could not understand it. Nothing made sense to him anymore. And then Maddie showed him exactly what was about to happen. The very power he had spent his entire existence wielding over her, the control he had used to bend her to his will without mercy, was now turning against him. In that single moment of clarity, Maddie seized him completely. She forced him back into the darkness and locked him there, permanently, irrevocably, with every ounce of strength she possessed. The moment it was done, the back of her skull began to seal itself closed on its own. Gabriel's face receded and vanished, Gone forever. Slowly, the room stilled, the violence drained away, the world settled back into something that resembled calm. And with that, this remarkable story came to its end.